The morning sun cast long shadows across the sprawling Montana ranch as Maria Rodriguez stepped carefully up the wooden porch steps, her worn nursing bag clutched tightly in her weathered hands. At 52, she had seen more than her share of hardship, but nothing had prepared her for the conversation she was about to have with Alina and Thomas Mackenzie, the elderly couple who had become like family to her over the past 3 years. Alina sat in her favorite rocking chair, a hand-knitted blanket draped across her frail legs, while Thomas dozed fitfully in his recliner nearby. Both were in their late 80s, and their health had been declining steadily since Maria first started coming to their remote ranch house twice a week to help with basic care and household tasks. "Good morning, Mrs. Mackenzie," Maria said softly, setting her bag down and immediately moving to check Alina's blood pressure. The older woman's eyes lit up at the sight of her caregiver, and she reached out with trembling hands to grasp Maria's arm. "Oh, Maria, dear, I'm so glad you're here," Alina whispered, her voice barely audible. "Thomas had another bad night. He was calling out for his son again, asking when James would come home from the war." Maria's heart ached as she listened. Thomas Mackenzie had been living with dementia for the past 2 years, and his episodes were becoming more frequent and intense. His confusion about time often transported him back to the 1970s, when his son James was serving in Vietnam, not realizing that James had returned safely decades ago and was now a successful businessman living 3 states away. As Maria gently helped Alina with her morning medications, she couldn't help but notice how much weight the elderly woman had lost in recent weeks. Alina had been the primary caregiver for her husband until her own health began to fail, and the stress of watching the man she had loved for 62 years slowly slip away was taking a devastating toll on her body and spirit. "Mrs. Mackenzie, have you been eating the meals I prepared for you?" Maria asked, though she already knew the answer from the untouched containers still sitting in the refrigerator from her last visit. Alina's eyes filled with tears as she shook her head. "I just can't seem to find my appetite anymore, dear. And Thomas, he barely recognizes me some days. Yesterday he asked me who I was and why I was in his house." The weight of the situation pressed heavily on Maria's shoulders as she moved about the house, tidying up and preparing breakfast for the couple. She had initially been hired by James Mackenzie to provide basic assistance to his parents 2 days a week, but as their conditions deteriorated, Maria found herself coming by nearly every day, often staying late into the evening to ensure they were safe and comfortable. What started as a part-time job paying $15 an hour had gradually transformed into something much more complex and demanding. Maria was now essentially providing round-the-clock care for 2 people who required constant supervision and assistance with even the most basic daily activities. She helped them bathe, dressed their wounds, managed their medications, cooked their meals, cleaned their house, and provided the emotional support they desperately needed. The problem was that James Mackenzie had stopped paying her regular wages months ago. Initially, he had explained that he was having some temporary financial difficulties with his business and asked if she could wait a few weeks for her payment. Maria, who had grown genuinely fond of his parents, agreed without hesitation. Those few weeks had stretched into months, and now she hadn't received any compensation for her work in over 4 months. Maria's own financial situation was becoming increasingly desperate. As a single mother who had raised 3 children largely on her own after her husband left when the youngest was only 5, she had always struggled to make ends meet. Her youngest daughter, Sophia, was now 22 and working as a nurse's aide in town, but she was barely earning enough to cover her own expenses. Maria's older children lived in other states and had their own families to support. The unpaid caregiving work for the Mackenzies was consuming nearly all of Maria's time and energy, leaving her unable to take on other paying jobs that could help her cover her basic living expenses. Her small savings account, which had never been substantial to begin with, was now completely depleted. She had fallen behind on her rent payments for the modest apartment she shared with Sophia, and their landlord had already issued one warning notice. Despite these mounting pressures, Maria found herself unable to simply walk away from Alina and Thomas. They had no other family members living nearby, and their nearest neighbors were miles away. She knew that without her daily care, they would likely end up in a nursing home, something Alina had begged her never to let happen. "Promise me, Maria," Alina had said just a few weeks earlier, gripping her hand with surprising strength. "Promise me you won't let them take us away from our home. This ranch is all we have left of the life we built together. I want to die in this house, in the bed where I've slept for 40 years. As Maria prepared Thomas's breakfast and gently coaxed him to take his morning medications, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since she first started working for the Mackenzie family. She had been working 2 other part-time caregiving jobs at the time, managing to scrape together just enough income to support herself and Sophia while slowly building up a modest emergency fund. The Mackenzie job had seemed like a blessing at first. James had offered her competitive wages and promised regular increases as his parents' needs grew more complex. The ranch was beautiful and peaceful, a welcome contrast to some of the more challenging environments where she had worked in the past. Elena and Thomas had welcomed her warmly from the very beginning, treating her more like family than hired help. Elena often insisted that Maria sit with her for coffee and conversation after completing her tasks, sharing stories about the early days of the ranch and showing her old photographs of James as a boy. Thomas, during his lucid moments, would regale her with tales of his military service and the challenges of building a successful cattle operation from nothing. Over time, Maria had become deeply invested in their well-being and happiness. She celebrated small victories with them, like when Thomas had a particularly good day and remembered her name, or when Elena managed to eat a full meal without feeling nauseous. She grieved alongside them during the difficult moments, holding Elena's hand when she cried about her husband's confusion, or sitting quietly with Thomas when he became agitated and afraid. Now, as she watched Thomas struggle to remember how to use his fork while Elena sat nearby fighting back tears, Maria faced an impossible decision. Her own survival depended on finding paying work immediately, but walking away from the Mackenzies felt like abandoning family members who desperately needed her care and support. She had tried calling James several times over the past month, hoping to discuss the unpaid wages and work out some kind of payment plan. Each time his assistant would take a message, promising that he would call back soon, but those return calls never materialized. When she finally managed to reach him directly, James seemed distracted and dismissive, assuring her that he would take care of everything soon without providing any specific timeline or details. Maria suspected that James either didn't fully understand the extent of his parents' decline or was simply too busy with his own life to face the reality of their situation. During his brief visits to the ranch, which had become increasingly rare, his parents often seemed more alert and capable than they actually were on a daily basis. Elena, in particular, made tremendous efforts to appear strong and independent when her son was around, not wanting to burden him with the full truth of their struggles. As the morning wore on, Maria helped Thomas with his personal care and assisted Elena with a gentle bath, tasks that required patience, skill, and genuine compassion. Both elderly individuals had maintained their dignity and privacy for their entire adult lives, and accepting help with such intimate needs was emotionally difficult for them. Maria approached these responsibilities with the utmost respect and professionalism, always preserving their dignity while ensuring their safety and comfort. After lunch, when both Elena and Thomas were resting, Maria sat alone in the kitchen and calculated her expenses on a piece of scrap paper for the 100th time that week. Even with the most conservative estimates, she needed at least $1,200 within the next 2 weeks to avoid eviction and keep her utilities connected. The 4 months of unpaid wages from the Mackenzies totaled nearly $8,000, money that could have solved all of her immediate problems and provided a stable foundation for the future. The irony was not lost on her that she was providing invaluable care to people whose son was reportedly quite wealthy, while she herself was facing homelessness and financial ruin. James Mackenzie owned a successful construction company that had built shopping centers and office buildings throughout the region. According to Elena, he lived in a large house in an exclusive neighborhood and drove expensive cars. Yet somehow, paying his parents' caregiver had apparently become a low priority for him. As the afternoon sun began to sink lower in the sky, casting a golden glow across the ranch's rolling pastures, Maria made a decision that both terrified and relieved her. She would give James Mackenzie 1 more week to make contact and arrange payment for at least a portion of the wages he owed her. If he failed to respond, she would have no choice but to notify Adult Protective Services and begin looking for other employment immediately. The thought of leaving Elena and Thomas in the care of strangers broke her heart, but Maria knew she couldn't continue sacrificing her own survival indefinitely. She had responsibilities to her daughter and to herself, and those obligations required her to make practical decisions rather than emotional ones. That evening, as she prepared to leave the ranch after ensuring both elderly individuals were settled safely for the night, Alina called out to her from the living room. "Maria, dear, could you come sit with me for just a moment?" Maria found Alina sitting in her chair, holding an old photograph in her trembling hands. It showed a much younger Thomas in his military uniform, standing proudly next to a beautiful woman in a white wedding dress. "We were so young then," Alina said softly, her voice filled with both joy and sorrow. "I was only 19 when we got married and Thomas was 21. Everyone said we were too young, that it would never last, but we proved them all wrong, didn't we?" Maria sat down beside her and took the older woman's free hand in both of hers. "You certainly did. 62 years of marriage is a beautiful accomplishment." Alina nodded, then looked directly into Maria's eyes with a clarity and intensity that had become rare in recent months. "I know our son hasn't been paying you, dear. I see the worry in your face, and I know you can't keep working for free. Thomas and I never had much money, but we always paid our debts and treated people fairly. I'm ashamed that our boy has put you in this position." Maria felt tears welling up in her eyes as she squeezed Alina's hand gently. "Mrs. Mackenzie, I don't want you to worry about any of that. You and Mr. Mackenzie have always treated me with kindness and respect. That's not your fault." "But it is my responsibility," Alina replied firmly. "You've been like a daughter to us, Maria. You've given us your time, your energy, your heart, and you've asked for nothing in return except the wages you rightfully earned. I don't know what we would have done without you these past months." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Alina expressing her gratitude and concern, while Maria tried to reassure her that everything would work out somehow. As she finally prepared to leave for the night, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that their relationship was approaching a major turning point, one that would change all of their lives in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Driving home along the winding country roads in her aging pickup truck, Maria rolled down the windows and let the cool evening air wash over her face. The radio played softly in the background, but her mind was too preoccupied with worry and planning to focus on the music. Tomorrow she would make that final phone call to James Mackenzie, and depending on his response, she would either continue caring for his parents or begin the difficult process of transitioning them to other arrangements. What Maria didn't know, as she pulled into the driveway of her apartment complex and climbed the stairs to her modest home, was that Alina Mackenzie was already formulating a plan of her own. The elderly woman had spent decades managing the ranch's finances alongside her husband, and she understood far more about their family's resources and her son's obligations than anyone realized. The conversation she would have with Thomas the next morning, during one of his increasingly rare lucid moments, would set in motion a series of events that would surprise everyone involved, including Maria herself. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with frost covering the pastures like a delicate white blanket. Thomas Mackenzie woke earlier than usual, his mind surprisingly clear and focused for the first time in weeks. Alina recognized the signs immediately. These moments of clarity had become precious and rare, often lasting only a few hours before the fog of confusion returned. "Alina," Thomas said, his voice stronger than it had been in months, "I need to talk to you about something important, about Maria." Alina felt her heart skip a beat. She had hoped for exactly this opportunity, knowing that any major decisions about their care and finances would need Thomas's input during one of his lucid periods. She quickly moved to sit beside him on the edge of the bed, taking his weathered hand in hers. "What about Maria, dear?" "I remember more than people think I do," Thomas said, his blue eyes sharp and determined. "I know our boy hasn't been paying her what we owe. I know she's been working for nothing while we've been taking advantage of her good heart. That's not how we raised James, and it's not how we've lived our lives." Alina squeezed his hand gently, grateful that his moral compass remained intact even when his memory failed him. "I've been worried about the same thing, Thomas. Maria is struggling financially, but she won't abandon us. She's too good a person to walk away, even though she should." Thomas struggled to sit up straighter, his jaw set with determination. "Where's that wooden box from my desk drawer, the one with the important papers?" Alina knew exactly which box he meant. For 40 years, Thomas had kept their most important documents in a carved wooden box that he stored in the top drawer of his desk in the den. Inside were their wills, insurance policies, property deeds, and other crucial paperwork that Thomas had always insisted on managing himself. "I'll get it for you," Alina said, but Thomas shook his head firmly. "We'll go together. I need to check something, and I want to make sure I'm thinking clearly about this." Supporting each other, the elderly couple made their way slowly to the den, a room that had served as the ranch's business headquarters for decades. The walls were covered with photographs documenting the ranch's history, awards from cattle associations, and family portraits spanning multiple generations. Thomas opened the wooden box with slightly trembling hands and began sorting through the papers until he found what he was looking for, a thick folder containing their financial records and account information. Despite his advancing dementia, he still remembered the details of their finances with remarkable clarity. "Alina, do you remember how much we paid off the ranch mortgage last year?" She thought for a moment, then nodded. "It was around $45,000. We used money from that certificate of deposit that matured." "And what about the cattle sale last fall? How much did we clear after expenses?" "About 32,000, if I remember correctly. James deposited it directly into our savings account." Thomas nodded slowly, his expression growing more determined. "So our boy has access to our accounts, and he knows exactly how much money we have available. There's no reason he can't pay Maria except that he's either forgotten about it or he's chosen to ignore his responsibilities." Alina watched her husband with a mixture of pride and sadness. Even in his declining state, Thomas's fundamental sense of fairness and responsibility remained unshakable. He had built his entire life around the principle that honest work deserved honest pay, and the idea that someone was providing care for his family without receiving proper compensation was deeply offensive to his core values. "What do you want to do about it?" Alina asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "I want to write Maria a check myself, right now, for everything we owe her. Then I want to make sure she gets paid regularly going forward, whether our boy takes care of it or not." Alina felt a surge of love for her husband, grateful that his essential character remained intact despite the disease that was slowly taking him away from her. However, she also knew they faced some practical challenges in implementing his plan. "Thomas, you know we can't write checks anymore. The bank requires James's signature because of the power of attorney arrangement. Remember when we had to change everything after you started having those memory problems?" Thomas's face darkened with frustration and anger. The power of attorney had been established 2 years earlier, during a brief period when his dementia symptoms had been particularly severe. James had convinced them it was necessary to protect their finances and ensure their bills were paid properly. At the time, it had seemed like a reasonable precaution, but now Thomas was beginning to understand how that decision had effectively removed their financial independence. "So our own money is locked away from us, and we have to beg our son for permission to pay someone who's been taking care of us for months." Alina nodded sadly. "That's essentially what it means, yes. But Thomas, I have an idea. What if we call the bank directly and explain the situation? We're still competent to make decisions about our own money, especially when you're having a clear day like today." Thomas considered this suggestion carefully, then shook his head. "Banks don't work that way anymore, Alina. They're too worried about lawsuits and regulations. Once they have that power of attorney on file, they won't do anything without James's approval." The couple sat in frustrated silence for several minutes, both acutely aware of their powerlessness in a situation that should have been simple to resolve. They owned their ranch outright, had substantial savings in multiple accounts, and received steady income from Social Security and Thomas's military pension. By any reasonable measure, they had more than enough resources to pay Maria's wages and ensure their continued care at home. "There has to be something we can do," Alina said finally. "Maria has sacrificed so much for us. She's working herself to exhaustion, and she's facing eviction because our son can't be bothered to write her a check." Thomas suddenly straightened up, his eyes bright with inspiration. "Alina, what about that old safe in the bedroom closet, the one behind your winter coats?" Alina's eyes widened as she realized what her husband was suggesting. Years earlier, Thomas had installed a small fireproof safe in their bedroom closet, primarily to store emergency cash and important documents that didn't require frequent access. They had occasionally added money to it over the years, but had largely forgotten about its contents. "I haven't opened that safe in at least 2 years," Alina admitted. Do you think there's enough money in there to pay Maria what we owe her? Only one way to find out, Thomas replied, pushing himself up from his chair with renewed energy. But first, I want to figure out exactly how much we owe her. Together, they returned to the kitchen, where Alina kept a small calendar on which she had been tracking Maria's visits and hours. While her memory wasn't perfect, she had maintained reasonably detailed records of when Maria arrived, when she left, and what tasks she had performed during each visit. Over the next hour, Thomas's sharp financial mind took over as he calculated Maria's wages with the precision of someone who had managed a successful ranch operation for decades. He factored in regular hours, overtime pay for the many occasions when Maria had stayed late, and additional compensation for the increasingly complex medical care she was providing. Alina, according to my calculations, we owe Maria at least $8,400 for the work she's done since James stopped paying her. That doesn't even include what we should be paying her going forward. Alina felt her stomach clench at the size of the debt. While they certainly had the resources to pay this amount, accessing those funds without James's cooperation was proving to be more complicated than either of them had anticipated. "Let's check that safe," she said quietly. "If there's not enough cash, we'll have to find another way to reach James and make him understand how serious this situation has become." The journey to their bedroom felt longer than usual, both of them moving slowly and carefully to avoid falls. The safe was indeed hidden behind Alina's winter coats, tucked into the back corner of the closet where it would be difficult for casual visitors to notice. Thomas had to think for several minutes to remember the combination, trying various dates and number sequences that had been significant in their lives together. Finally, the mechanism clicked open, revealing a surprisingly substantial collection of cash, bonds, and jewelry that they had accumulated over many years. "Good heavens," Alina breathed, staring at the contents. "I had forgotten we had put so much in here." Thomas began counting the cash systematically, separating it into neat piles by denomination. The bills were mostly 20s, 50s, and hundreds, accumulated over years of small deposits whenever they had extra cash from cattle sales, crop harvests, or other ranch income. $8,900, Thomas announced finally. "More than enough to pay Maria everything we owe her, with some left over for future payments if James continues to ignore his responsibilities." Alina felt tears of relief streaming down her face. For months, she had watched Maria sacrifice her own well-being to care for them, knowing that the situation was unsustainable but feeling powerless to change it. Now, suddenly, they had a solution that didn't require James's cooperation or approval. "We'll give it to her today," Thomas declared. "All of it, and we'll make sure she knows how grateful we are for everything she's done for us." As if summoned by their conversation, they heard Maria's familiar footsteps on the front porch, followed by her gentle knock on the door. Alina glanced at the clock and realized they had been working on their financial calculations for nearly 2 hours. Thomas's period of clarity was likely to fade soon, making it crucial that they act on their decision immediately. "Maria, dear, could you come into the bedroom, please?" Alina called out as Maria entered the house. "Thomas and I need to talk to you about something important." Maria appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, her expression concerned and slightly confused by the unusual request. She found both elderly individuals sitting on the edge of their bed, with Thomas holding a substantial stack of cash in his weathered hands. "Mr. and Mrs. Mackenzie, is everything all right? You both seem very serious this morning." Thomas looked directly at Maria, his eyes clear and focused in a way she hadn't seen in months. "Maria, my boy hasn't been paying you for your work. We know it, and we know it's wrong. A person deserves to be paid for honest work, and you've been doing more honest work than anyone should have to do for free." Maria felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment and discomfort. She had hoped her financial struggles weren't obvious to the elderly couple, not wanting to add to their worries during such a difficult time. "Mr. Mackenzie, you don't need to concern yourself with that. I'm sure James will take care of everything soon." "No," Thomas said firmly, extending the stack of bills toward her. "This is $8,900. It's what we owe you for 4 months of work, plus a little extra because you've been going above and beyond what anyone could reasonably expect." Maria stared at the money in shock, unable to process what was happening. The amount was more than she had dared to hope for, enough to solve her immediate financial crisis, and provide some breathing room for the future. "I can't take your cash," she protested weakly. "This is your emergency fund. You might need this money for medical expenses or other emergencies." Elena reached out and gently grasped Maria's hand. "Dear, you are our emergency. You're the reason we're still living in our own home instead of a nursing facility. You're the reason Thomas gets his medications on time and I have someone to talk to when the loneliness becomes overwhelming. This money belongs to you because you've earned every penny of it." The emotional weight of the moment was almost overwhelming for all three of them. Maria had spent months worried about her financial survival while providing care for people she had grown to love as family. Thomas and Elena had watched helplessly as their caregiver sacrificed her own well-being for theirs, feeling guilty and powerless to change the situation. "Please take it," Thomas added, his voice beginning to show signs of fatigue. "Take it before I forget why it's important and before our boy figures out a way to make this even more complicated than it already is." With trembling hands, Maria accepted the money, feeling the weight of both the cash and the trust that came with it. She knew this gesture represented far more than a simple financial transaction. It was a declaration of respect, gratitude, and family loyalty that transcended formal employment relationships. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you both so much. You have no idea how much this means to me." As Thomas's energy began to fade and confusion started creeping back into his expression, Elena took charge of the situation. "Maria, we need you to promise us something. Take this money and use it to take care of yourself and your daughter. Pay your rent, buy groceries, fix your truck if it needs repairs. Don't feel guilty about spending money you've rightfully earned." Maria nodded through her tears, carefully folding the cash and placing it securely in her purse. The relief she felt was almost overwhelming, but she was also acutely aware that this solution, while wonderful, was only temporary. James Mackenzie still needed to take responsibility for his parents' ongoing care costs, and the power of attorney situation would continue to complicate their financial independence. What none of them knew, as they shared this emotional moment in the modest bedroom of a Montana ranch house, was that James Mackenzie was at that very moment receiving a phone call that would force him to confront the reality of his parents' situation in a way that would change everything for all of them. James Mackenzie was reviewing construction blueprints in his spacious corner office when his secretary buzzed him on the intercom. The morning had been typically hectic, with phone calls from contractors, meetings with potential clients, and a dozen small crises that required his immediate attention. His construction company had 3 major projects running simultaneously, and the stress of managing multiple deadlines was beginning to take its toll. "Mr. Mackenzie, there's a woman on line 3 who says she needs to speak with you urgently about your parents. She says she's from Adult Protective Services." James felt his blood pressure spike instantly. He had been dreading this type of call for months, knowing that his parents' situation was becoming increasingly unstable, but hoping he could manage everything from a distance until he found time to address the problems properly. "Put her through," he said, setting aside the blueprints and bracing himself for what he suspected would be an uncomfortable conversation. "Mr. Mackenzie, this is Sarah Chen from the Montana Department of Health and Human Services. I'm calling because we've received a report of concern regarding your parents, Thomas and Elena Mackenzie. According to our information, they're both elderly individuals with significant health issues who may not be receiving adequate care." James closed his eyes and rubbed his temples, feeling a familiar wave of guilt and frustration washing over him. "I'm not sure what you've been told, but my parents have a full-time caregiver. Maria Rodriguez has been looking after them for several years now." "Yes, we're aware of Ms. Rodriguez," Sarah Chen replied. "In fact, she's the person who contacted us. She's expressed concerns about your parents' safety and well-being, and she's informed us that she hasn't been compensated for her work in several months. She's worried that she may have to discontinue her services due to her own financial hardship." The weight of his neglect hit James like a physical blow. He had been telling himself for months that he would sort out the payment situation, soon, always pushing the task to the bottom of his priority list as more immediate business concerns demanded his attention. Now his procrastination had escalated into a crisis that could result in his parents being removed from their home. "I can explain about the payments," James said, his voice defensive. I've been dealing with some cash flow issues with the business, but I fully intend to pay Ms. Rodriguez everything she's owed. It's just a matter of timing. Mr. Mackenzie, with respect, the timing has become critical. Ms. Rodriguez has informed us that she can no longer continue providing unpaid care, which means your parents will be left without adequate supervision within the next few days. Given their age and medical conditions, this constitutes a potentially dangerous situation that we're required to investigate. Sarah Chen's tone was professional but firm, making it clear that this wasn't a matter James could postpone or delegate. We need to schedule a home visit within the next 48 hours to assess your parents' living conditions and care needs. Depending on what we find, we may need to discuss alternative living arrangements if adequate care cannot be ensured. The phrase, alternative living arrangements, sent a chill down James's spine. He knew his parents would be devastated if they were forced to leave their ranch, and he could imagine the guilt and shame he would feel if his financial negligence led to such an outcome. What exactly would I need to do to prevent that from happening? James asked, already knowing the answer but hoping there might be some way to buy himself more time. The primary concern is ensuring that your parents have consistent, reliable care. Ms. Rodriguez has been providing excellent service according to our preliminary assessment, but she cannot continue working without compensation. If you can resolve the payment issues and establish a sustainable arrangement for ongoing care costs, that would address most of our immediate concerns. James glanced at his computer screen, where his business bank account balances were displayed. While his cash flow had been tight in recent months due to delayed payments from clients, he certainly had enough available funds to pay Maria's back wages immediately. His reluctance to address the situation had been more about denial and procrastination than actual financial hardship. I can have a check prepared for Ms. Rodriguez today, he said, making a decision that was long overdue. How much money are we talking about? According to Ms. Rodriguez's records, you owe her approximately $8,400 in back wages. However, I should mention that, when our intake specialist spoke with her this morning, Ms. Rodriguez indicated that your parents had already provided her with partial payment from their personal funds. James felt his stomach drop. The idea that his elderly parents had dipped into their own savings to pay for their care, while he had been ignoring his responsibilities, made him feel sick with shame. His parents had worked hard their entire lives to build financial security for their retirement years, and now they were depleting their resources because of his negligence. How much did they pay her? I believe the amount was substantial, though I don't have the exact figure. Ms. Rodriguez seemed quite emotional about accepting money directly from your parents, but she was facing eviction and had no other options. James hung up the phone after agreeing to the home visit and promising to resolve the payment issues immediately. For several minutes, he sat alone in his office, staring out the window at the city skyline while wrestling with the reality of what his procrastination had cost his family. His parents had always been proud, independent people who valued their dignity and self-sufficiency above almost everything else. The image of them scraping together cash from their personal savings to pay their caregiver, while their financially successful son ignored his obligations, was almost unbearable. Without hesitation, James picked up his phone and dialed his accountant's direct line. David, I need you to prepare a check for $8,400 immediately. Make it payable to Maria Rodriguez, and I need it ready within the hour. Of course, James. Should I ask what this is for? It's for my parents' caregiver, money I should have paid months ago. After hanging up, James cleared his calendar for the rest of the day and began making arrangements to drive to the ranch immediately. The 3-hour journey would give him time to think about how he would explain his behavior to his parents and to Maria, and how he could ensure this type of situation never happened again. As he gathered his things and prepared to leave the office, James couldn't stop thinking about the phone conversation with the social worker. The professional concern in Sarah Chen's voice had made it clear that his parents' situation was more precarious than he had realized. Maria's decision to contact Adult Protective Services hadn't been made lightly. She must have been genuinely worried about Thomas and Alina's safety and well-being. The drive to the ranch gave James plenty of time to reflect on how he had allowed his relationship with his parents to deteriorate to this point. After returning from Vietnam in the early 1970s, he had been eager to leave the rural lifestyle behind and build a life in the city. His business success had been a source of pride for Thomas and Alina, but it had also created distance between them that had grown wider over the years. Visits to the ranch had become increasingly infrequent as James's business expanded and his social life became more complex. Phone calls had gradually decreased from weekly to monthly to occasional. When his parents' health began declining, James had seen hearing Maria as a solution that would allow him to ensure their care without significantly disrupting his own life. Now he realized how selfish and short-sighted that approach had been. His parents weren't just clients who needed services. They were family members who deserved his attention, respect, and financial responsibility. Maria wasn't just an employee. She was the person who had become their lifeline, providing not only practical care but emotional support and companionship during some of their most difficult days. When James finally pulled into the ranch driveway, he was surprised to see Maria's truck parked near the house. According to his understanding, she only visited twice a week, but her vehicle's presence suggested she had been spending much more time at the ranch than he had realized. He found Maria in the kitchen, helping his mother with lunch while his father dozed in his recliner nearby. The scene was both heartwarming and heartbreaking. Maria was clearly treating his parents with genuine affection and care, while both Thomas and Alina seemed more frail and vulnerable than he remembered. "Maria," James said quietly, causing her to turn around with surprise. "I need to talk to you about the money I owe you." Maria's expression was guarded and cautious as she studied his face, trying to gauge his intentions. "Your parents already took care of most of it, Mr. Mackenzie. They used their own emergency savings to pay me what you owed." The directness of her statement hit James like a slap. There was no anger in her voice, just a matter-of-fact recounting of what had happened, but the underlying message was clear. His parents had been forced to compensate for his irresponsibility. "I know, and I'm ashamed that it came to that," James replied, pulling the check from his pocket. "This is to reimburse them for what they paid you, plus additional compensation for all the extra hours you've been working that I didn't even know about." Maria looked at the check with obvious relief, but her expression remained serious. "Mr. Mackenzie, I need to know that this isn't going to happen again. Your parents need consistent care, and I can't keep providing it if I'm not being paid regularly. I have my own financial responsibilities to consider." James nodded, understanding that he was essentially on probation. "I've already set up automatic payments through my business account. You'll be paid weekly going forward, and the amount will be increased to reflect the actual hours you're working rather than the part-time schedule we originally discussed." Alina had been listening to this conversation from her seat at the kitchen table, and she chose that moment to speak up. "James, dear, Maria has been taking care of us 7 days a week for months now. She's been doing the work of a full-time nurse, a housekeeper, a cook, and a companion all rolled into one person. What we were paying her originally wasn't fair even when you were actually paying it." The criticism from his mother, delivered in her characteristically gentle but firm manner, stung more than any anger Maria might have expressed. Alina Mackenzie had always been a woman of strong principles, and her disappointment in her son's behavior was evident despite her attempts to remain diplomatic. "I understand that now, Mom. I've been so focused on my own problems that I lost sight of what was really important. That's going to change." Over the next several hours, James had extensive conversations with both Maria and his parents about their daily routines, medical needs, and living arrangements. What he discovered shocked him. His father's dementia had progressed much further than James had realized, with frequent episodes of confusion and agitation that required skilled intervention. His mother was dealing with her own health issues that made it difficult for her to provide the support Thomas needed. Maria had essentially been functioning as a live-in caregiver without the title or compensation, often staying at the ranch until late in the evening to ensure his parents were safe and settled for the night. She was managing multiple medications, providing personal care assistance, maintaining the household, and offering the emotional support that both elderly individuals desperately needed. "I had no idea the situation had become this complex," James admitted to Maria as they stood on the front porch watching the sunset. "I thought you were just helping with light housekeeping and basic companionship." "It started that way," Maria replied. "But as their conditions changed, I couldn't just stick to a rigid job description. They needed more help, and I cared about them too much to just walk away when things got difficult." James looked at this woman who had been caring for his parents with such dedication and selflessness, and he felt a profound sense of gratitude mixed with deep shame. Maria had stepped up to provide the kind of family support that should have been his responsibility, asking for nothing more than fair compensation for her work. Maria, I want you to know that I'm committed to making this right. Not just the money, but everything. I should have been more involved, more aware of what was happening. My parents are lucky to have you, and I'm going to make sure you're properly supported going forward. As the conversation continued into the evening, James began formulating a plan that would ensure his parents could remain in their beloved home while receiving the level of care they needed. The plan would require significant changes in his own life and priorities, but he was finally ready to accept the responsibilities he had been avoiding for too long. What James didn't know, as he sat on the porch of his childhood home making promises to the woman who had been caring for his parents, was that Maria had already made some significant decisions of her own. The financial relief provided by his parents' emergency payment and his overdue compensation had given her the stability she needed to make some long-term plans that would benefit everyone involved, but would also surprise James in ways he couldn't yet imagine. 3 weeks after James's unexpected visit to the ranch, Maria Rodriguez stood in the small apartment she shared with her daughter Sophia, carefully folding her nursing uniforms and placing them in a large cardboard box. The financial relief from finally receiving her back wages had solved her immediate housing crisis, but it had also given her the breathing room she needed to make some important decisions about her future. "Mom, are you sure about this?" Sophia asked, watching her mother pack with a mixture of concern and admiration. "I mean, I think it's wonderful what you're planning to do, but it's such a big change." Maria paused in her packing and looked around the modest apartment that had been their home for the past 4 years. While she would miss the independence of having her own space, the plan she had been developing felt right in a way that surprised her with its clarity and certainty. "Sophia, I've been taking care of other people's families my entire adult life. Mrs. Peterson down the hall, the Johnson family before that, the elderly couple on Elm Street before we moved here. I've always gone to their homes during the day and then come back here to worry about them at night." She sat down on the edge of her bed, her expression thoughtful and determined. "But with the Mackenzies, it's different. They're not just clients anymore, they're family. And families take care of each other, especially when someone is scared and vulnerable and needs to know they're not alone." Sophia understood her mother's reasoning, but she also worried about the practical implications of what Maria was proposing. "But Mom, what if things don't work out? What if James Mackenzie changes his mind about paying you properly, or what if his parents' conditions get worse? You'll have given up our apartment and your independence." "Then we'll figure something else out," Maria replied with quiet confidence. "But Sophia, I've spent months watching Alina cry herself to sleep because she's terrified of being put in a nursing home. I've held Thomas's hand during panic attacks when he couldn't remember where he was or who the people around him were. These aren't just job responsibilities anymore. This is about giving two people dignity and comfort in their final years." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of Maria's cell phone ringing. The caller ID showed James Mackenzie's number, and Maria felt the familiar flutter of anxiety that still accompanied his calls, despite the improvements in their working relationship over the past few weeks. "Good afternoon, Mr. Mackenzie," Maria answered, her tone professional but warmer than it had been during their earlier interactions. "Maria, I've been thinking about our conversation last week, about the challenges of providing round-the-clock care while you're still commuting back and forth from town every day. I have a proposition that might interest you, but I want to run it by you before I mention it to my parents." Maria felt her heart rate increase, wondering if James had somehow intuited the decision she had already been contemplating. "I'm listening." "What would you think about converting the guest bedroom at the ranch into a permanent living space for you? I know it's not very large, but we could add a private bathroom and a small kitchenette, make it into a comfortable apartment where you could live on site. The arrangement would come with a significant increase in your salary to reflect the increased responsibility, plus all your living expenses covered." The offer was so close to what Maria had been hoping for that she had to sit down to process it properly. Living at the ranch would solve multiple problems simultaneously. It would ensure that Thomas and Alina had immediate access to help during medical emergencies. It would eliminate Maria's daily commute on dangerous rural roads, and it would provide the kind of stability and security she had been seeking for years. Mr. Mackenzie, that's a very generous offer. Can I ask what prompted you to consider this arrangement? James's voice carried a note of vulnerability that Maria had never heard before. Honestly, I've been doing some research on dementia care, and everything I've read emphasizes the importance of consistency and familiar surroundings. My father's condition is only going to get worse, and my mother needs to know that help is available immediately if something goes wrong. He paused, then continued more quietly. But beyond the practical considerations, Maria, I've come to realize that you're not just an employee to my parents. You've become family to them, and they've become family to you. This arrangement would recognize that reality and provide the stability that everyone needs. Maria felt tears welling up in her eyes as she listened to James acknowledge what had been true for months, but had never been openly discussed. The emotional bond she had formed with Thomas and Alina had transformed what started as a job into something much deeper and more meaningful. I would be very interested in discussing this further, Maria said, her voice slightly choked with emotion. In fact, I was already considering asking you about a similar arrangement. I think it would benefit everyone involved. Excellent. I'm planning to drive out to the ranch this weekend to discuss the idea with my parents. Would you be available to meet with all of us and talk through the details? After ending the call, Maria sat in stunned silence for several minutes, marveling at how dramatically her life had changed over the course of just a few weeks. The financial crisis that had seemed insurmountable was now resolved, and the uncertainty about her long-term employment had been replaced by an offer that exceeded her most optimistic expectations. Sophia, who had been listening to her mother's side of the conversation, looked both excited and concerned. It sounds like a great opportunity, Mom, but are you sure you want to give up this much of your independence? Living where you work means you're never really off duty. But sweetheart, that's already how it's been for months, Maria replied. I've been getting phone calls at all hours when Thomas gets confused or when Alina needs help with something. The difference is that now I'll be compensated fairly for that availability, and I won't have to worry about making it to the ranch safely during bad weather or when my truck is having problems. Over the next few days, Maria found herself mentally preparing for the conversation with the Mackenzie family, while also beginning to imagine how her life would change if the arrangement worked out as planned. She would need to coordinate with Sophia about keeping their apartment or finding Sophia a smaller place of her own. She would need to think about which possessions were important enough to move to the ranch and which ones could be donated or stored. Most importantly, she would need to have honest conversations with Thomas and Alina about what this arrangement would mean for their daily lives and their long-term care needs. While she was confident they would welcome her permanent presence, she also knew that having a caregiver living in their home would represent a significant adjustment for two people who had valued their privacy and independence for their entire adult lives. When the weekend arrived, Maria drove to the ranch with a mixture of excitement and nervousness that reminded her of job interviews from years past. She found James already there, sitting on the front porch with his parents and engaged in what appeared to be a serious conversation. Alina's face lit up when she saw Maria approaching, and she immediately called out, "Maria, dear, come join us. James has been telling us about the most wonderful idea." As Maria settled into the fourth porch chair, James began outlining his proposal in detail. The guest bedroom would be expanded and renovated to include a private bathroom, a small kitchenette, and a separate entrance that would provide Maria with privacy while keeping her close enough to respond to emergencies immediately. The idea would be that you'd have your own living space, but you'd be available for any urgent needs that might arise, James explained. We'd establish clear boundaries about your time off, but having you on site would provide enormous peace of mind for everyone. Thomas, who was having one of his clearer days, listened carefully to the proposal before speaking up. Maria, this sounds like it would be good for you, but I want to make sure you understand what you'd be getting into. My condition is going to get worse, not better. There may be times when I don't recognize you, or when I become agitated and difficult to manage. Living here means you'd be dealing with that constantly, not just during scheduled visits. Maria appreciated Thomas's honesty and his concern for her well-being. Mr. Mackenzie, I've already been dealing with those challenges, and I've learned how to help you through the difficult episodes. Having me here consistently might actually make those episodes less frequent, because you wouldn't have to adjust to different caregivers or worry about being left alone. Elena reached over and took Maria's hand in both of hers. "Dear, are you certain this is what you want? We love having you here, and it would be such a comfort to know you're nearby, but we don't want you to feel like you're sacrificing your own life to take care of us." The conversation continued for more than 2 hours, covering practical details like salary arrangements, time-off schedules, and renovation timelines. James had clearly thought through many of the logistical challenges, proposing solutions that would protect Maria's rights and interests while ensuring his parents received the care they needed. What impressed Maria most was the way James approached the discussion. Gone was the distracted, dismissive attitude she had encountered during their earlier interactions. He listened carefully to everyone's concerns, asked thoughtful questions about potential challenges, and demonstrated a genuine commitment to making the arrangement work for everyone involved. "There's one more thing I want to discuss," James said as the conversation began winding down. "Maria, I've been thinking about your professional development and your future security. This arrangement would provide you with excellent experience in geriatric care, but I also want to make sure you're building towards something that will benefit you after my parents no longer need this level of care." The tactful reference to his parents' mortality hung in the air for a moment before James continued. "I'd like to pay for you to complete a certified nursing assistant program or even an LPN program if you're interested. The training would make you more valuable in the healthcare field, and it would also improve the quality of care you could provide for my parents." Maria felt overwhelmed by the generosity and thoughtfulness of the offer. Professional certification had been a goal she had carried for years, but had never been able to pursue due to financial constraints and work schedule demands. "That's incredibly generous, Mr. Mackenzie. I would definitely be interested in pursuing additional training." As the sun began to set over the ranch, casting long shadows across the pastures, Maria looked around at the place that might soon become her home. The rolling hills, the solid ranch house, and the peaceful atmosphere felt like a world away from the cramped apartment complex where she had been living. More importantly, the two elderly people sitting beside her had become genuine family members whose well-being mattered to her as much as her own daughter's happiness. The opportunity to care for them in a stable, supportive environment while advancing her own career prospects felt like a gift she had never expected to receive. "I think we should move forward with this plan," Maria said finally. "But I'd like to propose a trial period, maybe 3 months, to make sure the arrangement works well for everyone before we commit to any permanent changes." James smiled and extended his hand to shake hers. "That sounds like a very reasonable approach. I'll start getting quotes for the renovation work tomorrow, and we can finalize the salary and benefit details once you've had a chance to review the written proposal." As Maria prepared to leave the ranch that evening, Elena pulled her aside for a private conversation. "Maria, I want you to know how much this means to Thomas and me. We were so frightened about what would happen if you couldn't continue caring for us. This arrangement feels like an answer to our prayers." Driving home through the gathering darkness, Maria reflected on the strange turns her life had taken over the past year. What had started as a part-time job helping elderly strangers had evolved into a family relationship that was about to reshape her entire future. The challenges ahead would be significant, but for the first time in years, she felt genuinely optimistic about what tomorrow might bring. What Maria didn't know, as she navigated the winding country roads back to town, was that James Mackenzie had one more surprise planned. A gesture that would demonstrate just how much her dedication and sacrifice had meant to the Mackenzie family, and how grateful they were for her willingness to treat strangers like family when family wasn't available to do the job themselves. 6 months later, Maria Rodriguez stood in what had become her cozy apartment within the Mackenzie ranch house, looking out the window at a landscape that had transformed from autumn gold to winter white to the fresh green of early spring. The renovated space was more beautiful and comfortable than anything she had dared to imagine when James first proposed the arrangement. The small kitchenette was perfectly equipped for her simple cooking needs. The bathroom was spacious and modern with safety features that would serve her well as she aged. And the living area was large enough for her essential furniture, plus a comfortable reading chair positioned near the window where she could watch the sunrise each morning. But the most significant changes over the past 6 months hadn't been to the physical space. They had been to the relationships and routines that now defined Maria's daily life. Thomas and Elena had not only welcomed her permanent presence, They had flourished under the consistent care and companionship she provided. Thomas's dementia symptoms had actually stabilized somewhat, which his doctor attributed to the reduced stress and increased consistency in his environment. While he still had difficult days when confusion and agitation overwhelmed him, the episodes were generally shorter and less severe than they had been when he was worrying about whether help would be available when he needed it. Alina's health had improved dramatically once she was relieved of the primary caretaking responsibilities for her husband. She was eating regularly again, sleeping better at night, and had even begun working in her garden with Maria's assistance. The two women had developed a friendship that transcended their caregiver-patient relationship, sharing stories, cooking together, and providing each other with the companionship that had been missing from both of their lives. Maria had also begun her certified nursing assistant program through the local community college, taking classes online in the evenings, and completing her clinical rotations at the hospital in town on weekends. James had not only paid for her tuition and books, but had also arranged for temporary relief caregivers to cover her absences so she could focus on her studies without worrying about her primary responsibilities. The arrangement had proved beneficial for James as well. Knowing that his parents were receiving excellent care around the clock had allowed him to focus on his business with less anxiety and guilt. His visits to the ranch had become more frequent and relaxed, focused on enjoying time with his parents rather than worrying about their safety and welfare. On this particular spring morning, Maria was preparing breakfast for Thomas and Alina when she heard an unusual amount of activity in the main house: voices, footsteps, and what sounded like furniture being moved around. When she went to investigate, she found James in the living room with two other people she didn't recognize, all of them engaged in an animated discussion while looking at documents spread across the coffee table. "Good morning, Maria," James said, looking up with a smile that seemed unusually bright and excited. "Perfect timing. I was just about to come get you. There's something important I need to discuss with you and my parents." Alina and Thomas were seated in their usual chairs, both looking alert and curious about the mysterious early morning gathering. Maria joined them, accepting James's invitation to sit down while wondering what could be important enough to warrant such a formal family meeting. "Maria, I'd like you to meet David Chen, my attorney, and Patricia Williams, my financial advisor," James said, gesturing toward the two professionals. "They've been helping me work out some details for a plan I've been developing over the past few months." Maria felt a flutter of anxiety, wondering if James was planning to make changes to their arrangement or if there were problems with the care she was providing. The presence of legal and financial professionals suggested that whatever was being discussed would have significant implications. "First, let me say that this meeting is happening because of how grateful our family is for everything you've done for my parents, and how impressed I've been with your dedication and professionalism over the past year," James began. "What started as a caregiving job has become something much more meaningful, and I want to make sure that's recognized in a concrete way." He picked up a folder from the coffee table and handed it to Maria. "This is a revised employment contract that makes some significant changes to our current arrangement. The salary increase we discussed has been implemented, but I've also added comprehensive health insurance, a retirement savings plan with company matching, and paid vacation time." Maria opened the folder with trembling hands, scanning the documents that outlined benefits more generous than any she had ever received in her working life. The salary increase alone was substantial, but the addition of health care coverage and retirement planning represented a level of security she had never expected to achieve. "Mr. Mackenzie, this is incredibly generous, but you're already paying me more than fairly for my work. I don't understand why you're offering even more." "Because what you're providing goes far beyond the job description we originally discussed," James replied. "You're giving my parents the gift of aging in their own home with dignity and comfort. You're allowing them to maintain their independence and their connection to this land that means everything to them. That's not something you can put a price on, but it deserves to be acknowledged." Patricia Williams, the financial advisor, leaned forward in her chair. "Ms. Rodriguez, there's one more component to this package that Mr. Mackenzie wanted to discuss with you. It involves long-term planning for your financial security." She opened her briefcase and pulled out another set of documents. "Mr. Mackenzie has established a trust fund that will provide you with a monthly income for the rest of your life, beginning when you reach retirement age. The amount will be sufficient to cover your basic living expenses, regardless of whether you're still able to work. Maria stared at the papers in disbelief. The concept of having guaranteed financial security in her old age had been so far beyond her expectations that she had never even allowed herself to dream about such a possibility. "I don't understand," she said quietly. "Why would you do something like this for me?" Thomas chose that moment to speak up, his voice clear and strong despite his ongoing struggles with dementia. "Maria, do you remember what I told you the day we paid you from our emergency fund? I said that a person deserves to be paid for honest work." He paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. "But you've given us more than honest work. You've given us love, respect, and dignity when we were at our most vulnerable. You've treated us like family when our own family wasn't available to do that job. That deserves more than just fair wages. It deserves gratitude that lasts a lifetime." Elena nodded emphatically, her eyes bright with tears of joy. "Dear, you saved our lives in more ways than you probably realize. We were frightened, lonely, and losing hope before you came to us. You gave us back our sense of safety and belonging in our own home." David Chen, the attorney, explained the legal details of the trust arrangement and the employment contract, ensuring that Maria understood her rights and protections under both agreements. Everything had been structured to provide maximum benefit to Maria while also protecting the Mackenzie family's interests. "There's one final component to this arrangement that I want to discuss," James said, his expression becoming even more serious. "Maria, this ranch has been in our family for 3 generations. When my parents are no longer able to live here, I want to make sure it continues to be a place where people can age with dignity and comfort." He pulled out a final set of documents from his briefcase. "I'm donating a portion of the ranch property to establish a nonprofit organization that will provide in-home care for elderly individuals who want to remain in rural areas but don't have family available to support them. The organization will be called the Mackenzie Foundation for Rural Elder Care." Maria listened in amazement as James outlined his vision for the foundation. The organization would recruit and train caregivers, match them with elderly clients, and provide the financial support necessary to make in-home care accessible to families who couldn't otherwise afford it. "I want you to consider becoming the foundation's first director," James continued. "Your experience, both personal and professional, would be invaluable in developing programs that actually meet the needs of the people we're trying to serve. The position would come with a substantial salary and benefits package, and you'd have the authority to hire and train other caregivers according to your standards." The room fell silent as Maria processed the magnitude of what was being offered to her. In the space of one morning, her life had been transformed from that of a single caregiver struggling to make ends meet to that of a healthcare professional with financial security and the opportunity to help countless other families facing similar challenges. "I need to ask you something honestly," Maria said finally, looking directly at James. "Why are you doing all of this? I mean, I'm grateful beyond words, but this level of generosity goes far beyond what anyone would expect." James's expression grew thoughtful as he considered how to answer her question. "Maria, when I was neglecting my responsibilities to my parents, you stepped up and took care of them without being asked and without expecting anything in return except fair payment for your work. When I failed to provide that payment, you dipped into your own resources to continue caring for them rather than abandoning them." He paused, his voice becoming emotional. "You demonstrated the kind of character and compassion that I should have shown as their son but didn't. You taught me what it means to treat family members with love and respect, even when it's difficult and inconvenient. This foundation isn't just about helping other families, it's about honoring the example you set for all of us." Elena and Thomas both nodded their agreement, and Maria could see the pride and affection in their eyes as they looked at her. Over the past year, she had become the daughter they had always hoped for, and they had become the parents she had needed during some of the most challenging periods of her life. "I accept," Maria said simply, her voice choked with emotion. "All of it. The contract, the trust fund, the foundation position. And I promise you that I'll work every day to make sure other families have access to the same quality of care that you've made possible for your parents." As the lawyers and financial advisor gathered their papers and prepared to leave, James pulled Maria aside for a private conversation. "There's one more thing I want to tell you, something I probably should have said months ago. Thank you for loving my parents when I wasn't there to do it myself. Thank you for giving them dignity and comfort and security when I was too busy to notice they needed it. And thank you for showing me what it means to be a good son, even when it took me far too long to learn the lesson. Later that afternoon, as Maria sat on the front porch with Alina and Thomas watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, she reflected on the unlikely journey that had brought them all together. What had started as a simple job posting had evolved into a family relationship that had changed all of their lives in profound and lasting ways. Sophia, who had driven out from town to celebrate the news, joined them on the porch with a bottle of champagne and 4 glasses. "Mom, I'm so proud of you," she said, settling into the chair beside Maria. "You've always taken care of everyone else, and now finally someone is taking care of you." As they raised their glasses in a toast to new beginnings and lasting friendships, Maria looked around at the faces of the people who had become her chosen family. The ranch that had once seemed like a temporary workplace had become her permanent home, and the elderly couple who had started as clients had become beloved family members whose well-being would always be her priority. The Mackenzie Foundation would officially launch in 6 months, with Maria as its first director and Alina and Thomas as its first success story. The organization would go on to serve hundreds of families across rural Montana and eventually expand to other states, but its roots would always trace back to a simple act of compassion. A woman named Maria Rodriguez who chose to treat strangers like family, and a family who chose to treat their caregiver like the hero she had always been. Years later, when people asked Maria about the secret to the foundation's success, she would always give the same answer. Treat every person with the same dignity and respect you would want for your own parents, and good things will happen for everyone involved. It was a simple philosophy that had transformed not only her own life, but the lives of countless families who discovered that home truly is where the heart is, especially when that heart belongs to someone who chooses to care without counting the cost.